Deep within the Arctic Circle lies the most dangerous place you could think of to sail a ship. It is a maze of islands and drifting ice, where channels open without warning and close again as fast. Nature here, one sailor wrote, is like a living, malevolent beast. This ice maze stretches for 1,000 miles across the Canadian Arctic, and finding a route across it, the fabled Northwest Passage, was the holy grail of exploration for more than 400 years. But of all the hundreds of attempts, 2 are legends in themselves. The first, led by Sir John Franklin, was the climax of Victorian Britain's passion for conquest, as arrogant and heroic as any expedition in history. The second, led by the Norwegian Roald Amundsen, was a penniless venture in a tiny second-hand fishing boat. But so revolutionary, it tore up the rule book of exploration. Both men would pay a devastating price in their battle with the ice maze. By the turn of the 20th century, the search for the Northwest Passage looked more deadly and more impossible than ever. The ice maze had defeated every challenger for 400 years, and with the loss of the Franklin expedition, had engulfed 2 ships and 129 men. And it might have been forgotten entirely, but for one man's ambition and the extraordinary journey that would take him to the heart of the hidden Arctic world. On a summer night in 1903, a tiny fishing boat slipped unnoticed out of Oslo Harbour. The man at the helm was a 30-year-old Norwegian called Roald Amundsen. He was setting out in search of the Northwest Passage, a challenge he'd dreamt of since his childhood, when one story above all fired his imagination.
Perhaps no tragedy of the polar ice has ever moved mankind as deeply as that of Sir John Franklin and his men. Strangely, it was the suffering that Sir John and his men experienced that appealed to me most. I also wanted to suffer for something. I wanted to head into the unknown.
As a boy, Amundsen ironically was fascinated by Franklin, this heroic failure really, but I think in Franklin he saw a hero, he saw the person he wanted to be.
He wanted himself to suffer in the ice, to be a kind of a hero who sacrificed something to explore these extremely difficult parts of the world. The history of the earth had only these last places for a man who really wanted to do something great.
The youngest of 4 brothers, Amundsen was born in Oslo in 1872. His father, a ship owner, died suddenly when he was 14, and in his place, Roald became the focus of his mother's ambitions. She wanted him to be a doctor, and Amundsen let her believe he would be.
He got money from his mother to study in the university, but he never went to the university. Amundsen was a man who very early learned to hide his ambitions. And I think his own mother was the first one he betrayed.
In truth, Amundsen was spending his days at the city library, poring over every account of the Franklin disaster. The more he read of the failure of this vast and lavishly supplied naval expedition, the more convinced he became that there was another way.
Every day my interest grew. Night and day I dreamt of being out in the polar snow and ice.
Above all, Amundsen was fascinated by the star of a new generation of polar explorers, Fridtjof Nansen. Using small, expert teams, Nansen had skied across Greenland, even to within miles of the North Pole.
Gone was the old idea of the siege, where you took your world with you and set about defeating the place. Instead, Nansen had the approach of a modern mountaineer. You hone your techniques to absolute perfection, and you remain flexible, both physically but also mentally.
For Amundsen, Nansen's ideas were a revelation. Impatient to prove his own survival skills, he started training with his brother in the mountains of Norway. Inexperienced and ill-equipped, on one occasion, he took a risk too far.
We had a northwest storm upon us. The only correct thing would have been to turn around, but our ski tracks were already drifted over, and the weather surrounded us on all sides.
That night, Amundsen and his brother dug snow holes to shelter from the storm.
When the first daylight came, he discovered I was frozen in. The snow had been wet when it fell and had frozen into a compact mass around me. Only after frantic digging was he able to set me free.
In the young Amundsen, in a way you see the classic young explorer. He's pitching himself against the world in this dangerously self-centered way. He sees almost a romance in the pain he's going to experience.
The Northwest Passage was now an obsession for Amundsen. At 21, when his mother died, he headed north to the Arctic Ocean. Inspired by Nansen, he was now piecing together a strategy for his assault on the most dangerous stretch of water in the world.
That big ships had so far not been able to get through the Northwest Passage. And he knew he was going into uncharted waters. And the smaller the ship, the easier it is to handle. So when he was searching for a vessel, he wanted something which he knew was strong enough to withstand considerable ice pressure, but at the same time so small that a small crew would be able to handle this vessel.
Amundsen knew that Arctic seal hunters used small, shallow boats in the ice. And with his family inheritance, he bought one, a battered 30-year-old sealer called the Gjoa.
What has not been accomplished with large vessels and brute force, I will attempt with a small vessel and patience.
For Amundsen, it was the beginning of his apprenticeship, learning at the feet of the one group of experts the British Navy never thought to consult, the working seamen who for generations had navigated the ice at the edge of the Arctic.
He was looking for people who had an experience coping with ships and with ice. I think it was partly to familiarize with the nature, the landscape, the weather, everything up there.
Amundsen's formula for his assault on the passage was taking shape. A team of Arctic experts manning a fast, light ship. Above all, an expedition capable of adapting to whatever the elements threw at them. Amundsen was 29, unknown and untested, already massing debts as he now tried to raise funds for a challenge the public associated with disaster.
So for the past centuries, navigators have found...
Desperate to win the interest of potential sponsors,
magnetic fields.
He told them his voyage was actually for the good of science, a quest to discover the true location of the magnetic North Pole. Believed to lie, as luck would have it, right on his path through the passage. It was a cunning ruse, but an expensive one. Amundsen needed a course in magnetic observation. By June 1903, his debts were spiraling. Creditors were threatening to impound the Gjoa. His dream, it seemed, was over. Until one last gamble occurred to him. When the creditors came looking for the Gjoa, they found her gone. The smallest and most ambitious assault on the Northwest Passage was on its way. Amundsen's crew of 6 was seasoned Arctic veterans. They were engineers, navigators, sealers. There were no scientists, not even a doctor. Academics, Amundsen believed, would undermine his leadership. He'd even won his master's license because he'd read explorers were sometimes overruled by the masters of their ships. On this voyage, Amundsen wanted total control. That morning in his cabin, he wrote,
It was glorious. No anxiety, no troublesome creditors, no tedious people with foolish prophecies or snares. The world seemed again to be full of spirit and delight.
It was the 16th of June, 1903. Amundsen planned to stop in Greenland for the last of his supplies. Then 13 days sailing would bring him to the edge of the Arctic, and the challenge he'd dreamt of since he was a boy. Today, the ice in the Arctic is under constant surveillance, tracked by satellite and reconnaissance aircraft. For modern ships, this data is a vital lifeline as they try to find their way through an ice maze that is constantly shifting with the wind and currents.
We provide a daily chart of where the ice is and where we think it's going to go. Every day a ship will get a warning of what kind of dangerous conditions are there. We regularly issue ice warnings due to pressure or ice warning due to rapid closing of leads. Ships get stuck. Ships get stopped. 75,000 horsepower icebreakers get stuck in the ice. That's the difficulty of Arctic navigation. It's knowing where the ice, the shifting maze matrix of ice, is going to be at the time when I want to get my ship through.
When Amundsen entered the Arctic, he had nothing but a compass, a sextant, and a half-map chart. He had no communications, no means of calling for help, only the instincts and experience of 7 men trying to outwit the ice.
This was a group of people who realized that these environments were too big, too great, too strong to defeat. You had to use them. You had to almost do a dance with these elements. And this new form of exploration is not without risks because you're very vulnerable.
The Gjoa's journey into the ice maze brought them first to Beechey Island. It was the site of the Franklin Expedition's first winter harbor back in 1845. For Amundsen, it was an extraordinary moment, a chance to tread in the footsteps of his childhood hero.
I had the feeling I was on holy ground. I pictured the expedition in all its splendor. The English colours flying, the officers in dazzling uniforms, Sir John's clever face full of character and gentleness. He had work for everyone and was loved by his men. But now sadness hangs over the island. From this point, the expedition passed into darkness.
Over the course of the 1850s, more than 40 expeditions searched for the missing men. As they did so, the once blank map of the Arctic was transformed. But no one yet knew if it was possible to navigate a route from ocean to ocean. Everything now depended on the route Amundsen took from here. His research had convinced him that the key to the passage lay to the south of Peachy Island, through a channel Franklin had taken, called Peel Sound.
The ice is clear enough.
Amundsen's gamble was based on something the Norwegian sealers had taught him, a quirk of the ice that might allow a small ship to succeed where Franklin's large warships had failed.
A small ship can not only squeeze between narrower leads between ice floes, but can also go in shallower areas, often where the ice recedes away from the coastline because of the heat generated by the shore. There'll be a narrow lead of open water, very shallow, very treacherous, but a shallow draft ship like Amundsen had is much more likely to get through that kind of an environment than the big ships of Franklin's era.
Amundsen was taking his men south on the very same route that led Franklin to disaster nearly 60 years before. For the first 350 miles, the journey passed without a hitch. But then, at the tip of King William Island, Amundsen faced a choice. Franklin had turned west, right into the path of the pack ice that trapped his ships. What Franklin didn't know was that he could have turned east. Only during a search for him was it discovered that a narrow channel separated the island from the mainland. Amundsen believed that if this channel was navigable, it might be the missing link in the quest for the passage. But the search party that found it had also passed on a warning. From land, the channel looked narrow and very shallow.
The waters that Amundsen was planning to sail into had never been charted, of course. They knew where the coastlines were, they knew where the islands were, but they didn't know where the rocks were, the submerged rocks. So sailing a ship into that is every mariner's nightmare. The only thing that's worse than hitting ice in a ship is hitting rocks on the bottom. And if the ice can drive you against those rocks, that's a nightmare scenario.
Now, as the Gjoa crept forward through the ice, one of their vital instruments failed.
We were making our way in waters never sailed. The compass, which had gradually been losing its capacity for self-adjustment, was now useless. We were steering by the stars, like the Vikings.
For 5 weeks, Amundsen and his men had been sailing through the Arctic's labyrinth of ice and islands. Their search for the Northwest Passage was now taking them deep into uncharted waters. Then one night after dinner, an incident occurred that set all their nerves on edge.
I was writing in my journal when I heard something that chilled me to the bone.
Fire! Fire! Fire!
In a moment, all hands were on deck.
Safe, I'm sorry. What about oil?
A fire had broken out in the engine room, right among tanks holding 2,000 gallons of petrol. We all knew what would happen if the tanks got heated. The Gjoa and everything on board would be blown to atoms like an exploded bomb.
The fire was out before it caught, but it was a harsh reminder of how far they were from help of any kind. It was now September. The Gjoa had travelled 600 miles into the Arctic ice, and within weeks the waterways would be frozen. She was still within the narrow channel to the east of King William Island, when 3 days after the fire, the first of the autumn storms set in. Amundsen feared most. The Gjoa had run aground, and her hull was splintering on the rocks. In the storm-force winds, it was safer to ride out the battering with the sails down. But Amundsen gave an order that would turn most sailors pale.
Ready?
He was going to raise the sails.
Right, bring up the main!
And risk losing the mast and rigging in the hope the gale would blow her off the rocks.
Wind came in gusts, howling through the rigging. Then we started a method of sailing that none of us is ever likely to forget.
And pull! Quickly, pull! Get her off! Not going fast enough! Bring up the mainsail!
The sleet and spray washed over the vessel. The mast trembled, yet one thump, worse than ever, and we slid off.
Amundsen had taken an almost suicidal risk with his ship, but as both master and commander, the decision was his.
There is something disproportionate and unreasonable and unwilling to take no for an answer about him. He is as stubborn and fanatical as any of his rivals. You have to be his kind of polar explorer, because he wants to do, in cold sober fact, what other people are quite content to dream about.
They'd survived with the Gjoa intact. The expedition was now more than halfway across the Arctic, but winter was closing in. On the south end of King William Island, they found a sheltered bay where the Gjoa could be safely frozen in for the winter. They christened their new home Gjoa Haven. Today, the settlement is home to more than 1,000 people. Though they live in modern housing and are connected to Canada by a daily supply plane, their life on the land has changed little.
For thousands of years we survived here. We are the Igloo Society people. You have to be able to know how to hunt and survive from the animals that you hunt here. You have to know the animal movement, the migration route of the caribou. You have to live with the seasons to know the dangers of the land as an Inuit.
King William Island was where Franklin's men were stranded and died. The few Inuit they encountered reported that even after 5 years on the ice, they couldn't build igloos or hunt seal. But even if they had, 129 men were unlikely to survive. The Inuit who came there to hunt rarely traveled in groups of more than 20. That was all the human life the island, 100 miles across, would support. "5 weeks after his arrival, Amundsen encountered Inuit hunters for the first time. Armed with a gun and 2 words of greeting, they approached.
When they were 200 yards away, they halted. Then there flashed through my mind, heated with excitement of warfare, the word Tama. and I shouted it at the top of my voice.
Thema! Thema! Thema!
In a moment, we flung away our rifle and hastened towards them, embracing and patting each other. It was hard to say on which side the joy was greater. You here? You here? Live here?
The next morning, when the Inuit returned to their camp, Amundsen went with them.
When we came within sight of the village, the Eskimos began to shout. I could catch only one word: Kabluna. White man. It was a strange scene. I shall never forget it. Out in the desolate snow landscape, I was surrounded by a crowd of savages, staring into my face and grabbing at my clothes. I was suddenly brought face to face with a people from the Stone Age, who as yet knew no other method of making fire than rubbing two pieces of wood together. We came here with all our ingenious inventions and firearms to people who still used lances and bows and arrows. But their tools, apparently so primitive, were as well adapted to their conditions as experience and the test of many centuries could have made them.
In the Victorian age, there was no use talking to the Eskimo. That didn't make you a great explorer. The Victorians wanted to prove that they were better than everyone else, that they had values to export. Perhaps it was a little bit ignoble to learn from people who ate their meat raw. In Amundsen, there was a totally different mentality. He saw the local people as people who offered the solution to that world. They belong to that landscape. There's no point in fighting it. It provides them with their food, their shelter, their medicine. It's all about seeing the place simply as a home, simply as a place that offers you everything.
That night, Amundsen slept inside a villager's igloo. The Inuit beside him were naked, covered only by their fur skins. Outside it was -10. It was his first lesson in the Inuit art of survival. In a laboratory in Toronto, the Canadian military recently used a climate chamber to test how effectively Inuit reindeer or caribou skins protected them from extreme cold. It was part of an experiment to investigate how the Inuit had adapted to the world they inhabit.
They found that the caribou hair has the density and the capacity to maintain the insulation, but the genius part of it is they were able to find the animal with the best fur characteristics.
By a process of elimination, the Inuit selected caribou, but scientists only later discovered why the fur was so effective. Air is nature's best insulator, and caribou hairs are hollow, a honeycomb of air chambers. The fur is so lightweight and heat efficient that it is yet to be matched by man-made fabrics.
It's quite interesting. It's amazing. The most important human organ for thermal regulation is the brain. You adapt to your environment, and that's exactly what the Inuit did. They look at their environment, they look what resource was present, they use it, they adapt it, and they achieve a level of protection that even today we have difficulties to achieve.
As the crew settled in for their first winter in the Arctic, Amundsen's preoccupation with the Inuit grew. To the amusement of his crew, he began to live and dress as they did. When he sweated in his old woolen clothes, they'd freeze as hard as a board. In these loose, light skins, he found he was warm and barely sweated at all.
Warm. Thank you.
It was the beginning of his education by a people perfectly adapted to life on the ice.
We set about learning the art of snow hut building. Taking hold of a monster knife with both hands, we cut the ice blocks. The snow must not be too brittle, as all the blocks will crumble. The hut is built in a spiral like a beehive, so that one layer rests on the previous one and extends a little further forward. Many a snow block did I get on my head when I tried this work.
We know that air is the best insulator. Snow is full of air. So if you cut blocks of snow and pile them and make a house, it provides the best insulation against the environment. It can be minus 50 degrees Celsius outside, minus 60 degrees Celsius outside. Inside it's going to be about minus 5. Amazing.
As the months passed, the Inuits' lessons in Arctic survival grew more and more intricate.
Seal hunting begins sometime in February, when the snow falls heavily and the seal cannot hear the steps of the huntsman. They find the seal's breathing holes out on the ice, but to detect the seal they must use an ingenious device. They take a bunch of swans down and attach a single thread to a hook with 2 claws. Then they lean forward, keeping their eyes riveted to the hole. As soon as the seal comes within yards of the hole, the movement of the water sets the swans down in motion. That is the signal. Hard.
The Inuit were teaching Amundsen to see the Arctic with new eyes. Beneath the frozen landscape that killed Franklin and his men, there was a hidden world teeming with life.
In the spring, there are fat salmon and reindeer. In the autumn, unlimited cod. And yet in this Arctic Eden, those brave travellers died of hunger. They must have stopped here and seen for miles before them the snow-covered land and no sign of life. There is not another place in the world so abandoned and bare as this in winter.
Amundsen's fascination with the Inuit was increasingly proving a distraction from the purpose of the voyage. In the spring of 1904, the first signs of a thaw appeared in the bay.
The ice is clearing.
After 6 months in the Arctic, the crew were eager to resume their attempt on the passage. But Amundsen had other plans.
So we should be able to move on in a couple of weeks, maybe a week if we want.
We're not finished here.
The ice is clearing. It may be our last chance.
He realized the skills he was learning from the Inuit would give him an expertise in polar survival that few explorers could rival. learning to master the ice and snow was becoming an obsession.
The crew didn't really understand what was going on with Amundsen. He likes more to go with the Eskimos. And then he's forgetting his crew and have no interest in his work. He wanted to fight against hunger, coldness, to show his greatness as a man. It's a landscape of death in a way, and he wanted to win over the death.
Above all, Amundsen was now convinced that the Inuit dogs were the key to survival. Earlier that year, during the bitterly cold weeks of March, he'd set out on a 90-mile journey to test his theory.
He realizes what the key to exploration for him is going to be, and it's all going to be to do with energy. With these dogs, he could now pass quickly through the landscape. He could get away with so much more. He could choose his time, choose his moment, and pass through the landscape that much more effectively.
But mastering the dogs and sled was far from easy. In temperatures of -60, Amundsen's experiment soon came to grief.
The first hour, when we were all fresh, things went very well. But then the difficulties began. It seemed as though we were driving the sledge through the sand of the desert. Every little snowdrift meant we had to stop. The poor dogs suffered greatly.
For 3 days, Amundsen pressed on, locked in a private battle with the terrain. Only when the dogs could go no further did he finally admit defeat, dumping half his supplies in the snow and turning for home.
I now saw there was little to be gained by going on in this way and decided to turn back. The dogs soon saw which way we were going, and we men were all glad we had given up our hopeless task. With the sledge lighter, we did the journey that had taken us 2.5 days in just 4 hours.
The Inuit elders, amused at Amundsen's disastrous journey, let slip the secret of the Inuits' ability to travel overland at any temperature. They coated the runners of their sleds with frozen moss, then with water warmed in the mouth, applied fine new layers of ice with a bearskin mitt. It was a surface that could run across any snow in the world. As Amundsen's second winter in the Arctic approached, it was clear that his decision to stay was beginning to change the life of the Inuit around him. More than 60 families now traveled to join the camp beside the Gjoa. It was more than the land had ever supported before.
There was but little doubt that our presence gave a special attraction to this spot. Many of them came to beg for food, though they had more than enough for the winter.
Amundsen also learned that some of the Inuit men had bartered their wives. Though his men suspected Amundsen of having affairs of his own, he banned the relationships. Gustav Wiik wrote in his journal,
The boss's mood is as sharp as a razor these days. He walks about, sulking like a little child, and meddles in things he preferably should stay away from. And from now on we can expect the most peculiar plans and heaven knows what else.
Amundsen discovered that there was congenital syphilis amongst some of the Inuit, which showed, of course, that they must have been in contact with Europeans. And there were other tensions. He believed that a polar expedition should be absolutely sexless. The whole concept of women ought to be banished.
Amundsen was an increasingly isolated figure. Though he was more focused on success than his hero Franklin had ever been, he never inspired the same easy affection and loyalty among his men.
In the beginning, he needs people. He needs support. But later on, he's more and more selfish. He don't need them anymore. So he becomes more and more lonely.
Amundsen's relationship with the Inuit was also growing more complicated. There were so many mouths to feed at the camp that he feared a raid on the ship's stores if the hunters returned empty-handed.
There was a great number of them collected about us. We had to teach them to regard us with the greatest respect. I spoke to them about the white man's power, that we could spread destruction around us, and even at a great distance, accomplish the most extraordinary things. It was for them to behave properly and not to expose themselves to our terrible anger.
He became a kind of a king in his crew, of course, but also with the Inuits. He made the laws. He could kill a man if necessary. He was the master, the big chief, the king.
Amundsen had come in search of the Northwest Passage, but in staying to learn the secrets of the Inuit, he'd brought his 20th century world to the Arctic and set in motion something that could never be reversed.
They changed him. But in the same way, he understood that he was destroying their life, that he was beginning a process which was going to lead to the destruction of their culture.
I believe the Eskimo, who live absolutely isolated from civilization, are the happiest, healthiest, and most honorable. My sincerest wish is that civilization may never reach them.
Amundsen himself had stayed long enough to learn the skills he'd one day use to beat Captain Scott to the South Pole. But ahead of him now lay the last stretch of the Northwest Passage. A single narrow channel through the ice maze was all that stood between him and the prize he'd dreamt of since he was a boy.
The shoals run across here. How far? 5 miles to the east and the west, and the currents are running strong.
Okay, so how can we get through?
During the spring of their second year, Amundsen sent a scouting party to investigate the route ahead. They reported a dangerous channel of shoals and drifting ice to the south of the island. They were just 90 miles from a charted waterway that led to the open sea. But if this channel defeated them, the dream of the Northwest Passage was over. On August the 13th, 1905, Amundsen set sail from Joa Haven down the strait that at one point narrowed to just 9 miles.
We call it Simpson Strait now, and it's a very, very narrow channel, and it's very, very shallow. And there's rocks sticking up all over the place. It's an area that modern ships just totally avoid. For Amundsen to navigate through this channel, it was going one way or another, around rocks, around shallow areas, with very, very little room to maneuver. This is dangerous. This is dangerous work.
Hold course!
The thought that here, in these troublesome waters, we risked spoiling everything was anything but pleasant. I couldn't get rid of the thought of returning home having failed. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat.
Boss! Boss! Vessel in sight! Vessel in sight!
On the morning of the 26th of August, 1905, Amundsen had finally gone below to sleep when the crew sighted a vessel ahead. It was a whaler, and she was flying the Stars and Stripes. On her hull were painted the words San Francisco. Her captain sent over a greeting. "You must be Captain Amundsen. Congratulations."
The Northwest Passage was done. My boyhood dream was accomplished. A strange feeling welled up in my throat. I was somewhat overstrained and worn. It was a weakness in me, but I felt tears in my eyes. Vessel in sight. Vessel in sight.
Roald Amundsen, as a young boy, is reading about Franklin, and he is saying to himself, I'm going to do this where he failed, where his men died, and I'm going to make it.
For 400 years, the search for a Northwest Passage had destroyed ships and claimed the lives of hundreds of men. Amundsen at last had found the fabled route across the Arctic, but it lasted only until the wind changed and the maze shifted again. As long as ice filled the channels of the Arctic, the passage they were chasing was a phantom. Today, a century on, a new force is at work. In the last 30 years, global warming has thinned the Arctic ice by 40%. This is what happened on one glacier in less than a decade. Scientists now predict that in 50 years' time, the Arctic will be clear of ice in summer to the North Pole. If that happens, the Northwest Passage will become a shipping highway, and the shortcut to Asia, dreamt of since the 16th century, will become a reality. But there is a stark warning for any sailors contemplating a journey into the heart of the ice maze.
There's no infrastructure available to support those ships yet. No aids to navigation, no search and rescue capability. And the gradually reducing ice that we talk about is not a nice, smooth thing. It's very dynamic, but there's still going to be those difficult ice years, and there's going to be lots of them. It's just that more and more frequently will be the years when there is less and less ice. And that's the real danger for Arctic shipping, is that this illusion of an open Arctic channel will attract people who are unprepared perhaps, to go into the Arctic with ships that are not capable, times of the year when it can be dangerous to do so.
For the Inuit, the prospect of a shipping lane through their territory is simply the latest in a long line of invasions that threaten to destroy their culture. In the century after Amundsen's triumph, numerous expeditions followed, naming and mapping the Arctic, claiming sovereignty over the land and the Inuit who lived there.
You know, education system came. The Hudson's Bay Company came to trade with the Inuit, no matter who they were. They all changed the Inuit way of life.
As for the man who proved the passage was possible, Amundsen went on to become one of the most successful explorers of all time. The lessons he learned from the Inuit helped him conquer his biggest prize, the South Pole. Using a team of dogs, he made it on the 14th of December 1911, 5 weeks ahead of Captain Scott. His success, though, came at a price. He never married. He lived alone in Norway, in a house filled with Arctic mementos.
The biggest man in the world. A kind of an emperor of the Arctic and the Antarctic. Totally famous, but also totally alone. Feeling the coldness, the hunger, always the same men around you, make a strong impression. The ice had its price. Man is going to win over nature, but nature is also going to win over man. The ice and the snow are going inside.
Nearly 20 years later, aged 55, Amundsen set out to help in the rescue of an airship missing in the Arctic. His plane vanished without trace. Just like his hero Franklin, he disappeared into the Arctic wastes.